Hey, everybody. So this is going to be sort of a short summary of Chapter 7, a little bit more detail as well. Chapter 7 deals with political participation and voting. And political participation is simply involvement in activities intended to influence public policy and leadership. And most people, the most they do in political participation is vote. They're usually not running for office, or nor are they active in campaigns. Now, this chapter will talk about low voter turnout in the United States. It's going to be talking about that most people don't do much other than just vote, and that Americans can actually differentiate between personal and public lives that you might see. So let's talk about voting first. And voting is sometimes known as suffrage. Suffrage is the right to vote. And so when we talk about universal suffrage, meaning allow almost everybody right to vote. Now, originally, when the founders created the Constitution, not everybody was going to be able to vote, obviously. They had decided that the people that are going to be able to vote were white male property owners. They didn't think that people who didn't own property should be allowed to pass laws on people who did. They certainly didn't believe that women were capable of being voters, nor minorities were capable of being voters. Well, it slowly changes over the next 160 years, because we will see that by the time we get around to the Jacksonian era, or probably around 1860, almost all white males could vote who were 21 or older. And they had dropped the property requirements, partly because of urbanization. And then we got to the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, which allowed for African Americans to join the war. And over 200,000 joined the Northern armies. 38,000 of those African American troops die. And so there was talk afterwards that, hey, if they could fight and die for their country, should they be allowed to vote? And that will occur with the passage of the 15th Amendment, which allowed African American men the right to vote. It says the right to vote cannot be denied based on race, creed, color, or previous condition of servitude. It didn't allow women the right to vote. Even though the Seneca Falls Conference of 1848 had asked for that, it didn't happen. Now, keep in mind, the 15th Amendment is passed in 1870, but there had already been states or territories that had started to allow women to vote, Wyoming being the first territory to allow women to vote in 1868. Well, women will get the right to vote by the 19th Amendment, and then the right to vote will be extended to 18-year-olds by the 26th Amendment. But through all these things, there was a lot of different ways of trying to prevent people from voting, especially throughout the South after the passage of the 15th Amendment. There was the poll tax, which said you had to pay a tax before you could register to vote in federal elections. That was eliminated by the 24th Amendment. There was what they called the grandfather clause, arguing that if your grandfather wasn't eligible to vote in the last presidential election, which was 1860, then you would not have been eligible to vote. That's struck down by Supreme Court in Gwynn versus Oklahoma. There were literacy tests where you had to take a test before you could register to vote. That'll be suspended by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Texas came up with what they called the all-white primary, where since there was only one party in Texas at the time, the Democratic Party, they argued that the Democrats were a private club, and therefore only members of the club could vote in the primary, and that allowed no minorities from voting in the primary. The all-white primary would be struck down in the 1944 case of Smith versus Allwright. And then there was these, a lot of these places had strict residency requirements, saying you have to live someplace for 2 years or so before you could register to vote. That tended to discriminate against tenant farmers and sharecroppers. Subsequent Supreme Court cases have put the maximum of 30 days of residency in federal elections and a maximum of 55 days in state and local elections. Now, it doesn't mean that certain people are still not allowed to vote. Of course, if you're in prison, you're not allowed to vote. If you've been declared mentally incompetent, you're not allowed to vote. Or if you don't have a residency. So if you're homeless and you don't have a place of residence that you can require, you can put down your homeless shelter as a residence, then you can't vote, because they have to know place of residence for what precinct that you're in. So today, we have fairly close to universal suffrage. If you're 18, you're a U.S. citizen, resident of your state, and registered to vote, you can vote. Now, there is some talk, and your book doesn't go into this, about allowing 16-year-olds to vote in some places, because if you say no taxation without representation, well, 16-year-olds work and they pay taxes, but they can't vote. But I don't see that being pushed anywhere strongly across the country, but it is talked about, so I thought I would bring it up. So let's talk about voter turnout. Now, the United States, if you compare to other Western democracies, our turnout's lower. We're lucky in presidential elections, although this one might be a record setter for the last 120 years, if we can get 55% of people to turn out. In this case, they think maybe 60% will turn out. That still means 40% of the Americans didn't vote. So with Joe Biden being declared the victor in this election, and he wins 50% of the vote, that still means that's 50% of 60%. So that means 30% of the vote voted for Joe Biden, whereas 70% of the country either didn't vote or voted against him. So that's true with every president, Trump, Obama, you name it, because of the low turnout. But it's interesting that our presidential elections have our highest turnouts. The presidential election will have around 55, and then midterm elections will drop to almost 30%. And then the worst of them are local elections. Local elections often will have a 5-6% turnout. So as an elected official myself, as the mayor, I may have a turnout of 10%, and I get a majority of the 10%, which means that maybe 6% voted for me and 94% either voted against me or didn't vote at all. So we know that we have a low voter turnout. And why do we have a low voter turnout? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. There's a lot of apathy. People just don't care. They don't see it as affecting them directly, and so they don't go vote. There's also a lot of ignorance. People don't know when there's elections, especially local elections sort of seem to fade away. People often say their vote doesn't count, but I think you see in this election with some of these close races in states, your vote does count. I've always said that. We had a city council election last year where one person won by one vote. And then in 2000, George Bush effectively won the presidency by 538 votes out of 100 million cast. So yeah, your vote does count. So, and some would argue there's a lack of civic duty today, that people really just don't feel like that's really their job, that maybe we don't teach enough of civic responsibility, giving back to your community, that we focus more and more on individuals than the community. We can all debate that. It's up to you. And another thing is something called election burnout. There are some people who believe that we have so many elections, and you're probably with me here. It seems like these elections just go on and on and on. I mean, we just finished a presidential election. Filing period for local elections that'll happen next May starts in January, in 2 months. And so we're right back into the election cycle. And as soon as Joe Biden takes office on January 20th as the new president, the presidential race will start again. There'll be Republicans who will start visiting New Hampshire and Iowa, where the first primary and caucus is, and just exploring the idea of running. And so it'll start right back up. It doesn't stop. So let's talk about who votes real quickly. Well, who votes, it tends to be, and this isn't an absolute rule. It just means that you're more likely. College educated tend to vote more. Senior citizens tend to vote more. Younger people don't vote as much. But really, one of the key factors is going to be education, because education teaches you the relative value of it. It doesn't mean that there aren't college educated people who don't vote, and there are people who are non-college educated who do vote. It just means that they're more likely to vote. Now, if we wanted to try to get more people to turn out and vote, what could we do? Well, there's a lot of things we could do. We could make Election Day a holiday. That's been talked about. You could have same-day registration. That's certainly possible. We've already done early voting, allow people to early vote. And we've done motor voting, where you can go in and register your car or get your driver's license and register to vote. But we've done all those things, and strangely enough, we just haven't seen a big turnout. That we've seen this lower turnout that we used to have. And maybe it's because, just guessing here, historically, is that, you used to have a higher turnout in the 1800s, but also you didn't have the distractions of today, right? In the 1800s, you didn't have professional sports, you didn't have movies, radio. And so politics was the entertainment of the day, and was what you listened to. Today, you can be pulled in a lot of directions. Maybe you're not interested in politics, but you're active at your church, right? You're doing something there, or you're active at your school, or you're active in some other civic or charitable organization. And so there's only a certain amount of time in your day to be involved, right? And so that's certainly a possibility. So while we're at it, let's really quickly talk about the issue of voter fraud. Voter fraud is virtually non-existent. I know we talk a lot about it, but when they do the studies for it, and Texas has done it and everybody else has done it, it just is fairly non-existent. It's rare. In-person voter fraud is incredibly rare, and mail-in voter fraud also very rare. So I'm not sure why that still popped up there, but when we look at it, we don't see defined the numbers. Well, there are other ways to not be active politically other than just voting. You can be active online. A lot of people do Twitter and other social media accounts. Some people are active in their community, making change, political change. Some people get involved in political movements where you can have a chance to express your opposition to government policy, whether that was the Tea Party movement that came up around 2009 about government spending, the Occupy Wall Street people that came about over the collapse of the Wall Street in 2009, whether it was the Black Lives Matter movement on the issue of police and the Black community, the Me Too movement doing with sexual harassment, movements against gun violence. There's just a lot of different movements that go out there, right to life movements, you name it, that are out there trying to make political change. So, and they can make a difference. So that's voting, and that's voting and political participation. I'm trying to keep this short so that it doesn't take so long to load. So if you have any questions, you can always email me and I'll answer them. But I will be doing one more video that'll be out next week over the media, chapter 10 in the media.